This tutorial is a project of nonprofitaccountingbasics.org, a free resource developed by the Greater Washington Society of CPAs Educational Foundation.
Hello, my name is Shawn Miller, and today we're going to be discussing procurement under the OMB's new Supercircular. Just by way of some background, let's discuss what the new Supercircular is. As you may already know, back in December of 2013, the OMB issued what is officially called the Uniform Guidance, also commonly known as the Supercircular, related to nonprofit entities that receive federal funding and how they are to manage that money. Why is it called a Supercircular? As you can see here, it superseded many existing circulars. The primary ones that we'll be concerned about here is A122, Cost Principles of Nonprofit Organizations, and A110, Administrative Requirements for Higher Education, Hospitals, and Other Nonprofits. Just again, by way of background, you'll see the effective dates here. You'll notice this circular is now in effect for essentially any funding you're going to receive. However, if you had existing funding that was in place prior to the effective date of this new Supercircular, they will continue to be governed under the old circulars and old requirements. What was the point of the new Supercircular, and how is it impacting procurement? One of the main intentions of creating this new Supercircular was to reduce the administrative burden and, as relevant to us, the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. How do they do this? Eliminating duplicative and conflicting guidance, focusing on performance over compliance, encouraging the use of IT and shared services, providing for consistent treatment of costs, limiting allowable costs, setting standard business processes, encouraging non-federal entities to have family-friendly policies, strengthening oversight, and targeting the audit requirements. So now how does that lead into procurement? Again, just so we're all on the same page, there's procurement and then there's purchases of supplies, which is a separate policy and relates to micro procurement, which we will discuss. But supplies, you can see here, the acquisition cost of computer equipment is less than the capitalization threshold established for financial statement purposes, or $5,000, it should be considered a supply. Now this was a big deal, as many places had been capitalizing laptop purchases of $1,000, $2,000. Now these will fall under this micro purchase procurement method, which hopefully will reduce the administrative burden on the organizations. All right, so getting into the procurement standards themselves and the changes that have been made and what you need to follow going forward. So first of all, what's the purpose of the procurement standard? To ensure that such materials and services are obtained in an effective manner and in compliance with the provisions of applicable statutes and executive orders. So while they want it to be in compliance with the statutes, they do want it to be effective and efficient. That's why they came out with multiple levels of procurement standards. Some other things before we get into actually how you go about the procurement process. You need to have a code of conduct under these standards. Recipients shall maintain written standards of conduct governing the performance of employees engaged in the award and administration of contracts. So anyone who is involved in procuring services, whether it be the initial contact of the potential vendors, approving those contracts, monitoring to make sure that the vendor complies with the contract, all need to be covered under this code of conduct. No employee, officer, or agent shall participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract supported by federal funds if a real or apparent conflict of interest would be involved. And that's important, not just an actual conflict, but if there's the appearance of a conflict of interest, that person has to recuse themselves from the selection process. Competition. Obviously, they want you to spend the federal money in the best way possible and get the most bang for your buck. And as such, they want to make sure there's actual competition for these contracts. All procurement transactions shall be conducted in a manner to provide open and free competition. Recipients shall be alert to organizational conflict of interest as well as non-competitive practices among competitors that may restrict or eliminate competition or otherwise restrain trade. Again, organizational conflicts, not just real conflicts, but conflicts in appearance as well. Solicitation shall clearly set forth all requirements that the bidder or offerer shall fulfill in order for the bid or offer to be evaluated. Again, this concept of transparency. The judging criteria and the selection criteria should all be laid out in the information sent to the bidder, the potential vendor. Again, it eliminates some of the subjectivity and and increases the transparency of the process. General procurement standards. So obviously non-federal entities are encouraged to use federal excess property in lieu of purchasing new. This comes up frequently in job training programs or construction type programs where the federal government will have military construction equipment that they no longer use. They'd prefer to use that than purchase something new. Must maintain records sufficient to detail the history of procurement. So for any procurement process you go through, you need to have the method, and we'll get into the different methods momentarily, the contract type, the contractor selection or rejection, and the basis for that contract price. So again, you're going to need to list everyone who submitted a bid on the project, and if you selected them or rejected them, and then your final selection and why you chose that vendor. It should be noted that the vendor selected does not have to necessarily be the lowest cost vendor, right? There could be other factors, history with the company, reputation, experience, and so on, but that does need to be documented. Time and materials contracts, obviously the government would prefer that you not use time and material contracts. The potential for fraud, waste, and abuse is obviously much greater in that type of contract. So again, if no other contract is suitable, you can use that. However, the contract does need to have a ceiling price. So maybe time and materials, but there's got to be a cap on that contract. So getting into the actual types of procurement and the procurement standards themselves. All right, there are 5 types of procurement. All of them must comply with the general standards. Complies with the non-federal entities' documented procedures in place. That's important to note. If your written procedures are more restrictive and more stringent than what's in the Supercircular, that's what you get held to, and that's what you need to follow. For example, if you have a policy that says regardless of dollar amount, all procurements need 3 bids, that's what you need to follow, not what's in the standards we're going to follow. The second is that the purchase is necessary. Third, that you use open competition to the extent required by each method. You comply with your own conflict of interest policy, and that the purchase is documented. Now, procurement standards do not apply to indirect costs. Only goods and services charged directly to a federal award. That's important to remember. Again, however, though, if you have other policies, internal policies, you need to follow those, whether they be indirect or direct costs. So the methods of procurement, what are the different methods and what is in the Supercircular? The first item is what's known as micro purchases. And this they put in this effort again to decrease the administrative burden. Supplies and services under $3,000 may be awarded without soliciting competitive quotations if the price is reasonable. And hopefully you distribute that among qualified suppliers. Now that $3,000 is not on a per check basis. So for example, if you enter into a contract for $5,000, but you're going to pay it in 2 installments of $2,500, that is above this threshold. So this is on a per contract basis. So we'll get micro purchases. We're above that. Then we get into the small purchases. Supplies, services, or property below what is currently $150,000. So this is going to apply to a majority of things that are getting purchased under procurement. various consulting contracts, if you're purchasing office equipment, and so on. So here you have to obtain quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources. Now, they don't necessarily tell you what that number is. They'll leave that up to your judgment and your documentation. Typically, what I've seen is anywhere between 3 to 5 quotes that you're going to get for a particular service. Sealed bids. Sealed bids, I think, are rare, primarily in the construction world. Formally advertised firm fixed price contract, and typically the lowest bid is who gets the proposal. Again, you'll see this typically maybe with government construction projects or building construction projects. And then competitive proposals. RFPs must be publicized in any number of places. You can do this. There's websites where you can publish these. There's professional journals in the area you're looking for. Solicited, again, from an adequate number of qualified resources. Written method for conducting technical evaluations. May award to firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the program, price and other factors considered. As was mentioned earlier, not necessarily the lowest bidder, but the overall the best bidder. This is a popular and a very frequently used method for those contracts that are above $150,000. They're publicized, very clearly laid out as to what the criteria is going to be to judge these proposals, what experience you're looking for, and so on. And the final is non-competitive proposals, also known as sole sourcing. And these, they say available in limited situations, really should be avoided in almost all situations. The only time when a sole source or non-competitive proposal is practical is if there truly is someone who is uniquely qualified to provide the service you're looking for, and possibly nobody else is available or qualified to perform that service. Again, if you do non-competitive proposals, that definitely needs to be documented in your procurement files as to why you felt it was okay to sole source this contract. So now you've gone through the process, you've determined what methodology of procurement you need to use, what follows from there. So there's a cost price analysis that needs to be done. Price analysis in various number of ways, including comparing the quotations, market prices, any possible discounts, all that needs to go in together. The cost analysis is the flip side, kind of reviewing each element to determine that it's legitimate, that the pricing and the cost that the bidder submitted is reasonable. Again, you don't want to accept a lower bid that's not done reasonably, and then later on down the road you're either going to get less service or you're going to have to adjust the contract. Procurement records. Okay, you've determined the methodology, you've gotten your bid, done your cost benefit. Now, how are you going to document that? And we mentioned this earlier. For anything above that small purchase threshold, you need to know the basis for the contractor selection. Again, justification for lack of competition if there was sole sourced, and the basis for the award cost or price. And lastly, what do you need to maintain going forward in terms of contract administration under the procurement standards? What you need is a system that will ensure contractor conformance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of the contract, and to ensure adequate and timely follow-up. So you need something that lays out, here was the contract, here were the milestones, or here were the deliverables, who's to monitor that, and how do we know they're going to meet those deadlines? And the recipient needs to evaluate the contractor performance and document whether you've met the terms of the conditions. So essentially what they want is a full closed loop in this system. Starting with all the bids that you got on the contract, what methodology you were using, your cost price analysis, who you chose and why you chose that contractor, what are the terms of the contract, and then closing that loop by saying, did they meet their performance goals within the budget that was in the contract? And this is something they want you to maintain going forward also, if you're going to use that vendor again, they want you to have records. Did they perform adequately or not? So those are the procurement standards under the new OMB Supercircular. Hopefully that was clear and helpful. Most of the purchases, I believe, would fall either under the micro purchase or small purchase threshold. So again, hopefully the Supercircular reduces some of the administrative burden that was put on people. But the key thing to remember with the procurement standards and with any standards under the new Supercircular is the documentation piece of it. Documenting why you chose a particular vendor, why you thought the price was reasonable, and if they performed. If you have all those records, you should satisfy the procurement standards easily. Thank you.